Hello and welcome to my channel. Vice Rhino here. Today I'm doing something a little bit different. I'm looking at an article on a website called Christian Courier, in which the author attempts to explain why Genesis is not poetry, which is a conclusion that I might even agree with, but the way he goes about presenting his information is, shall I say, interesting? He also asserts that since it is not poetry, it must be taken literally, because non-poetic fiction is something that can't possibly exist, I guess. Since it's an article, I enlisted someone's help in reading it for me so that you can easily tell the difference between the article and me replying to the article. And, ever the masochist, when I asked for someone to read an article for me, Shannon Q was the first person to jump on that grenade.
I'm really good at sounding like an asshole. You made the right choice. Apparently, that's a skill I have. Oh, who can sound like a pompous douche? I'll get Shannon to do this. Okay.
So let's take a look.
Liberal theologians have long sought to recast the Genesis record of origins by a variety of exegetical manipulations. One of these is the theory that the Mosaic narrative in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 is not a document of prose-oriented history. Instead, it's alleged to be poetry.
This is an inaccurate description, to say the least. I have never heard anyone, no matter what their background or position on the creation story, suggest that Genesis 2 is not prose. I have myself, on several occasions, used the fact that Genesis 2 is most definitely prose to contrast it with Genesis 1, which is potentially poetic, though certainly scholars are not in 100% agreement on the matter.
It is contended that history narrative as a discipline did not exist before the era of the Greeks. Instead, historical information was conveyed through various genres, one of which was poetry.
There is some truth to this, but historical accounts have been around since roughly 3500 BCE, starting with Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Sumeria. Egypt has a pretty good historical record going back to the early dynastic period of about 3000 BCE. But you're probably referring to Herodotus here, the man who is considered the father of history. He gets that title because he was the first person that we know of who used systematic investigative methods when compiling his histories in an attempt to record events accurately rather than being something like a scribe in the pharaoh's employ who is tasked with writing about how awesome that pharaoh is at the expense of accuracy.
These scholars labor under the illusion that a poetical interpretation relieves the Mosaic record of its conflict with modern science, especially in the matter of the Earth's age, in contrast to that of human history.
Not so. I have certainly argued that it is a form of poetry, and there is some scholarship to back this up. Dr. Kit Wheeler of Carson Newman University points out that the text is metered, indicating that it was likely originally a hymnic chant, and it uses devices that are common in Hebrew poetry: repetition, chiasms, parallelism, catachresis, and anaphora. Chiasm is when certain words or concepts are introduced in a particular order, and then later they or similar terms are repeated in reverse order. So in Genesis 1, we find several chiasms. For instance, in verses 9 and 10, it starts with, "Let the waters under the heavens be gathered together," and ends with, "And the waters that were gathered together he called seas." Parallelism is when a pattern is established and balanced by grammatical structure and length. Proverbs is a great book of the Bible for studying parallelism. It's got quite a few different kinds within it, and basically the whole book is just a series of parallelisms. These are phrases that, for want of a better description, are catchy or have a nice ring to them. The bigger they are, the harder they fall is an example. In Genesis, one example is verse 2. The parallelism doesn't quite make it through the translation into English, but a more literal translation that demonstrates the parallelism would be, "And darkness from Elohim hovered over the surface of the deep water, and a windstorm from Elohim hovered over the surface of the deep water." Catachresis is hyperbole, exaggerated figures of speech that are literally impossible. For instance, God's blessing of humanity, which, consequently, Genesis 1 never actually says goes back to one singular man and woman. It is ambiguous at best. We don't, even today, have dominion over every fish, bird, and beast. Anaphora is the repetition of beginning clauses, which is obviously the "and God said" phrases. So, at the end of the day, it is debatable whether or not Genesis 1 is poetry, but there is definitely a case that can be made that it is.
The fact is, however, numerous portions of sacred scripture are framed in poetic language, and yet are anchored in genuine history.
Well, the poem in Numbers 24 is not recounting historical events. It's part of the story of King Balak and the prophet Balaam, when Balak asks Balaam to place a curse on Israel, but he blesses them instead. So in this case, if we are to believe the story is true, it is simply recording what he said in his prophecy, whereas Genesis 1 is supposed to itself be the record of events. Also, it's worth noting that the only archaeological evidence that King Balak even existed places him as the rival of King Mesha for the title of King of Moab. So this is a story that is likely not literally true either. Psalm 148 is just a song of praise. It mentions the creation myth, but aside from just referencing their creation myth, it is not even attempting to tell an historical story. The verse in 1 Timothy is about the divine mystery of godliness, and is a poem about his awe at this mystery more than an account of historical events.
Yet, such are acknowledged as documents that are divine in origin and authoritative in force.
That's actually an interesting point. Jesus, in John 10:34, is referencing Psalm 82 as being part of the law. I'll keep this in mind next time I bring up the point about Jesus saying that he did not come to change the law. Not one jot or tittle shall pass from the law as long as heaven and earth still exist. And someone chimes in with the idea that he was talking about one specific aspect of the law. Well, when he refers to the poetic psalms of worship as law, how can we really know which law he was referring to then? But still, calling a psalm a law isn't really a great argument for a literal interpretation of Genesis 1. I mean, really, the verse of the psalm that he is quoting is, "You are gods, son of the Most High, all of you." If we're taking this literally, then with the context that Jesus was using it, the Pharisees that are about to stone Jesus are all gods, and polytheism is correct because there are more than one God. Even if one is the supreme one, more than one is still polytheism.
The poetic segments of the Bible are as inspired as our law narratives, or those commonly recognized as historical testimony. Poetry is merely a literary form. On its own, it has nothing to do with history, pro or con. It may or may not reflect a historical background.
This is true. In fact, there's a whole genre of poetry called historical poetry, in which historical events are recorded poetically. However, one of the distinguishing features of such a genre is that the historical poet does not need to worry overmuch about being factually accurate and can take poetic license with their work. In other words, yes, there is a debate about whether or not Genesis is poetic, but even if it is poetic, that does not mean it is not literally true. And if it's not poetic, that also doesn't say anything about whether or not it's literally true. Now, it's not literally true, but we know this for reasons other than which genre it was written in. The genre is, ultimately, irrelevant when discussing whether or not it is a literally true story.
The motive exposed. With the advent of Darwin's theory of evolution and the billions of years which were postulated as necessary for that alleged process to be achieved, the religious community, ever mesmerized by the speculations of science, came to the stark realization that the biblical record of Earth's history could never be harmonized with the escalating theories of geological dogmatism.
I believe that the passage in Jastro's book that you are referencing, with what appears to be an incorrect abbreviation, is this paragraph toward the end of a flowery description of a potential sequence of events that led to the human lineage of apes being separated from the non-human apes. And just as a quick lesson in the correct usage of reference abbreviations, CF comes from the Latin confer and is supposed to be used when making a contrast. So in this instance here, your usage indicates that Jastrow is presenting something other than the billions of years for evolution. For this one, you should have just said, "See Jastrow 1977," to indicate that you are presenting the reference as an example of what you are stating. And the theories of geologic dogmatism, as you put it, were developed long before evolution. Scientists in Darwin's time were largely unsure of the age of the Earth, but one thing was sure. It was way more than just a few thousand years old. Estimates range from 75,000 years old on the low end to infinitely old, but what it came down to is that the concept of deep time came first, and since there was plenty of evidence for deep time, that explains how life could have diversified in a Darwinian fashion.
Thus, desperate measures to reconcile the biblical view of origins with naturalistic theories gradually were conceived. The gap theory, i.e., the notion that a span of billions of years passed between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2, captured the imaginations of some.
Well, clearly there's more to the gap idea than just the passage of time between verses 1 and 2, but certainly that idea has more merit than a simplistic literal interpretation. You could then see the creation days as loose approximations of the evolution of life. Sure, they're not in the right order, but capturing the details of exact scientific accuracy was not the goal of the author, so perhaps there are other reasons for these discrepancies. Theological reasons, metaphorical reasons, whatever you like. As soon as you remove strict literalism from the picture, it becomes way easier to harmonize it with science.
The idea that the days of the creation week were not literal days, but rather embraced epochs of time, likewise became faddish. Yet see Exodus 28 through 11, where the days of the creation week are depicted as ordinary days, just like the Sabbath.
See, now here would have been the perfect spot to use the CF abbreviation. You're comparing what Exodus 28 through 11 says with what has been said about the days representing entire epochs of time. But anywho, could that not actually be the purpose of presenting a billions of years creation event with 7 simple days? What I was taught when I was a Christian is that God created the way he did in order to provide an example for us for our work week. God is all-powerful. He didn't need to rest on the 7th day. He did it to provide an example for us. Well, if we needed this example to tell us that a regular day off is good for us, could he not create over billions of years but give the creation narrative to us in a story that exemplifies the ideal work week? Also, this kind of begs the question, if the Bible tells us what the ideal work week is, then why does scientific research into the matter show that shortened working hours increases productivity significantly? I mean, I suppose they were living in an agrarian culture at the time, so you couldn't really take more than 1 day off a week without risking your crop yield, but that sounds like something that could have easily been clarified in a book that is supposed to teach us the ideal way to live. Maybe a 6-day work week is okay for manual labor, but when you transition to thinky jobs, shorter hours with regular breaks and minimal interruption make for better quality work.
Eventually, shortly after the dawning of the 20th century, others began to suggest that Genesis 1 and 2 are somewhat poetic in nature.
Again, I have never heard anyone suggest that Genesis 2 is poetic. Never. This is the first time I have ever run into that claim. Genesis 2 is obviously prose. It's ideological prose that makes use of several puns in explaining why certain words sound alike in ancient Hebrew, but it is quite certainly prose.
Though they insist this view does not compromise the history of the Mosaic record, admittedly the poetry genre does allow for a greater degree of interpretative flexibility.
Well, really, with the way they are written, they allow for interpretative flexibility. It does not have to be a poem in order to be interpreted less than literally. The fact that they discuss things that we know are not possible as if they actually happened is good evidence that they are not actually literal stories. Snakes don't talk. Eating fruit doesn't give you knowledge. If you keep reading into chapter 4, you get the stories of people who are the fathers of all who play musical instruments or work with bronze or tend livestock. These are not genetic dispositions, yet Genesis talks about them as if they are. It's almost like Genesis is meant as an etiology rather than a literal story of what happened.
With some writers, this accommodates an exegetical manipulation that is easier to reconcile with their perception of science.
Well, yes, except it's not just their perception of science, it's also backed up by mountains of evidence from dozens of scientific fields and thousands to millions of actual scientists. And really, a proper exegesis of Genesis would likely reveal that it is not and never has been meant as a literal narrative of the creation story.
It has been argued that in the ancient world, few people wrote in prose. Supposedly, the Egyptians were virtually the only example of such. For thousands of years, it is claimed people wrote almost exclusively in poetry, though elements of history were woven within the poetic fabric.
I'm not sure who you were talking to that told you that few people of the ancient world wrote in prose. The vast majority of the oldest surviving documents that we have are prose, and they're usually boring things like receipts for a transaction. They weren't writing "you traded 5 cows for 7 goats and 2 casks of beer" in poetry.
Some scholars thus began to contend that the first chapter of Genesis reflects a song format.
Yes, it has been suggested that it was meant to be sung or chanted.
It also has been asserted that the first two chapters in Genesis are cosmology, not history, as if cosmological, i.e., creation-oriented, theme could not be historical, even if conveyed by an inspired writer.
Well, the first chapter does match up pretty well with the general cosmology of the area and time. It's an easy enough thing to see, just pretend that you don't know anything about modern science and look around outside. You don't see the curvature of the Earth, so clearly the Earth is flat. If you walk far enough in any direction, you get to water, so the Earth is surrounded by water. Water also falls out of the sky sometimes, and the sky is blue just like water, so there must be a lot of water up there in the sky. But water doesn't just float, so there's got to be a dome keeping it out, with windows that sometimes let it in when it rains. Since you can't see very far into water, the sun, moon, and stars must all be within this dome, and because a boat will float away without an anchor, there must be pillars or something anchoring the Earth to the sea in which it floats. That's the picture that Genesis 1 paints, so as long as we're taking it literally, that's the universe we end up with. So even young Earth creationists reinterpret Genesis to fit their view of reality. Most of them know by now that the Earth is a globe, and we know about the water cycle now, so we know where rain comes from, and we know why the sky is blue, and we know that there's no solid dome up there, so creationists use this knowledge, impose it on the narrative in Genesis, and ignore or reinterpret the verses that obviously describe an incorrect cosmology.
Some insist, therefore, that while the events of Genesis 1 and 2 are historical in basic substance, they were not written in the genre of history. A number of elements within this view warrant examination.
Well, since the genre of history had not been invented yet, I would tend to agree that it was not written in that genre. It's not like there are only two genres, history and poetry. There is a lot more that it could potentially be. It's possible, likely even, that Genesis 1 is a reworking of old gods into the new one. In ancient Mesopotamia, there are certain motifs that span across the different Mesopotamian cultures, one of which is the local culture's god triumphing over the watery beast that represents the other culture's god. We see that in the Bible when Leviathan shows up, but as the story develops, both in the Bible and in the other cultures, the battle becomes less of a battle and more of a just showing up, and the mere presence of the new god is enough to defeat the beast. In the Babylonian story, Marduk defeats the watery dragon Tiamat, and the Hebrew word tohu, which is usually translated as without form in Genesis 1, has an etymological relationship to Tiamat. Also worth mentioning is that the word for void, bohu, is connected with Behemoth, which was the Jewish representation of the Babylonian Apsu, who was Tiamat's mate. So when you take a closer look at Genesis 1, it looks like a retelling of the Babylonian creation story featuring Marduk as the creator.
The history of history. As noted above, the allegation that the first two chapters of Genesis are cosmology, not history, is inaccurate. First, these questions are appropriate. When did this interpretive contrast between cosmology, the structure and origin of the universe, and history commence?
Technically speaking, you could consider cosmology to be a branch of history, I guess. But usually when we're speaking of history as a genre, it's the history of human events and achievements. I feel like you're splitting hairs here, though. What does it matter? If God really created everything in 6 literal days just 6,000 years ago, then the scientific study of cosmology should show that, regardless of how we interpret Genesis or what genre we consider it to be.
By whom was this distinction initiated?
Someone who figured out that since humans didn't create the universe, the creation of the universe should not fall under the category of human history, I'd imagine.
What are the criteria that delineate the former from the latter?
Well, one is a record of things that humans do. And an historian's job is to piece together these events from different accounts, and since these different accounts were recorded by other people, and we know that people are prone to exaggeration, misremembering, and outright lying, then it is the historian's job to figure out which accounts, or parts of accounts, are accurate and which are not. For cosmology, though, it's the same evidence for everyone. If one astrophysicist does some calculation and finds that his calculations point to the universe having been compressed into a singularity about 13.8 billion years ago, it is not the job of future scientists to figure out what his motivations were, whether his other works were reliable, or anything like that. They have the same data that he had, so they can directly check his work. Not only that, but his work likely would have made several predictions. If it happened this way, then we would expect to see constant background radiation that has been shifted through the expansion of the universe into the microwave spectrum. So we can look for this background microwave radiation, and guess what? We found it. So cosmology is a branch of science that deals with data, calculations, and predictions, while history is a branch of the humanities which deals with exaggerations, lies, and human motivations.
I submit this view reflects a false premise and is both artificial and subjective.
Well, then you are wrong. I don't think you could find a legitimate historian who would agree with you that history and cosmology are the same genre. In order to make this equivalence, you just have to rely on the fact that history can loosely refer to anything that happened in the past, and since the origin of the universe is in the past, anything written about the origin of the universe is clearly in the genre of history.
It is artificial in that it subtly suggests no one could write a history of the origin of the universe. Yet a writer, under the influence of the Spirit of God, as Moses was, certainly could have.
See, this is where you're getting your genres crossed. The distinction now is that cosmology is a branch of science, whereas history is the record of human events. If God created the world in the way it is laid out in the Bible, even if that were scientifically demonstrable, I would still refer to it as cosmology instead of history. Calling something cosmology is not disparaging. History can be true, and cosmology can be true. It is not an either-or choice where if it's history it's true, but it's cosmology so it's false. I feel like you're splitting hairs over a meaningless distinction here. Whether you consider Genesis 1 and 2 to be historical in genre or cosmological in genre, one thing is certain. They are demonstrably not literally true.
The contrast between cosmology and history is subjective since it concocts an arbitrary rule for identifying a bona fide historical document, and appears to deny that cosmology and history can overlap.
When speaking of history in the genre sense, it is all about human events. If humans were not involved during the origin of the universe, then it is not historical in genre, it's cosmological. This says nothing to whether or not it's true, it's just a genre distinction.
Second, as mentioned earlier, the assertion that history as a discipline did not exist before the Greeks is inaccurate. The fact is, as noted by Professor R. Laird Harris, it now is conceded that written history extends back at least to 3000 BC, centuries before Greek civilization became a literary force.
Well, when speaking of genres, let me just point out that no matter when the genre of history was invented, Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 do not fit in that genre. Period. End of story. They are not citing sources. They are not concerned with telling different perspectives of the same story. They are written as stories, not histories.
The late Dr. Samuel Kramer, America's foremost scholar on ancient Sumer, the earliest known civilization in Mesopotamia, in his book History Begins at Sumer, declared that among the thousands of tablets recovered from Sumer, there was a significant display of a variety of types of genres, which, considering their age, is both startling and revealing. These included myths, epic tales, hymns, lamentations, collections of proverbs, fables, and essays. Humankind has always been interested in its history. It is unrealistic to think that the ancients rarely wrote historical narrative.
And now, imagine if someone came to you and told you that the Enuma Elish was the actual true history of the world. Here's its creation story. The high heaven and earth did not yet have names, and Apsu, who begat them, along with Chaos, Tiamat, who was their mother, mingled their waters together and created gods to work the earth for them. But the gods were distressed at their heavy workload and all the toil that was required of them, so Enki and his half-sister Ninki put another god to death and had his body and blood mixed with clay. From that material, in the garden of the gods, that was named Eden, they created the first humans in the likeness of the gods. Do you consider this story to be historical? Actually, wait, don't answer that. You might, because it's basically the same one as you already believe, just with more gods instead of only one god and a mysterious group that is referred to in the first-person plural we. It actually looks like the biblical creation account purposely had their god dominating over the chaos, Tiamat, and her mate, the void, Apsu.
Third, the acknowledgement that the Egyptians wrote historical prose significantly weakens the argument that Genesis 1 and 2 are poetry, not prose. Moses, the author of the Pentateuch, was reared for 40 years in Egyptian culture as the adopted son of Pharaoh's daughter. Thus, he was afforded the finest of Egyptian education. Is it not reasonable, therefore, to conclude that Moses was familiar with literary prose?
If we take the story of the Exodus at face value and assume that Moses was the author, which he most certainly was not, but if we assume that he was, this doesn't mean anything. It's pretty much a certain thing that the authors of the Pentateuch were all very well educated. That is not in doubt. In fact, whether it be poetry or prose, it shows signs of being written by formally educated scribes. Nobody is arguing that Moses was uneducated, therefore Genesis 1 is poetry. And prose is essentially just any writing that is not poetry. We have recovered ancient documents like receipts for trading cattle. Those are prose. I assume you're throwing the word literary in front of it to try and distinguish it from such mundane documents, but really, even if Genesis had been written as complete fiction where the author was not even trying to record events that he considered to be true, you could still call that literary prose. Prose does not mean true. Literary prose does not mean true. Now, I'm not saying that the authors of Genesis really did believe it to be fiction, but they also didn't necessarily consider it to be just a plain retelling of true events, especially considering the fact that they felt free to borrow from other cultures' myths quite liberally.
Note the following observation by John J. Davies, former president and professor of Old Testament and Hebrew at Grace Theological Seminary.
Well, I looked into Grace Theological Seminary to see what they're all about, just because, in my experience, the only scholars who hold to Mosaic authorship of the Pentateuch are the ones that are tied to organizations that have theological impositions that they want to make into the text, usually run by evangelicals. And sure enough, Grace Theological Seminary is run by the evangelical group Charis Fellowship. So, Buddy is a professor of Old Testament and Hebrew at a seminary with ties to an evangelical organization that proudly displays their outdated and bigoted beliefs on their website, though they do have expiration dates on them, so they are proud bigots, but only until August of 2023. Yeah, I know, that's probably just the date of their next conference when they'll get together and vote that they will stay bigots, but still, I find the idea of an expiration date on your bigotry to be amusing.
Since Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was mighty in words and in deeds, Acts 7:22, it is not unreasonable to assume that he had the intellectual capacity and training to be the primary author of Genesis. Archaeological light on Egyptian education indicates that as Moses grew in the royal court, he would have received much formal training in reading and writing and hieroglyphic and hieractic scripts, in copying texts, and in writing letters and other formal documents.
Sure. Nobody is arguing that the authors of Genesis were uneducated hicks. Well, I mean, I'm sure there are some people parroting that old line about believing a book written by ignorant nomadic goat herders, but that's not a real argument. And that argument only really works when you take the books literally and simplistically, because they describe the world working in a way that it obviously doesn't work. So really, the people who do argue for the ignorance of the authors of the Pentateuch wouldn't have a leg to stand on if it weren't for young Earth creationists insisting on taking the thing literally. But regardless of the education level of whoever wrote the Pentateuch, any scholar that is not affiliated with evangelical organizations generally agree that the Pentateuch has multiple authors and none of them are Moses. Will the author actually present some evidence for his claims, or will he just keep insisting that it's true because it's prose? To find out, tune in tomorrow. Same Rhino time, same Rhino channel.